Happy Tuesday morning to everybody. It is another off-season episode of First Down South. I am your host, Matt Scalisi, and I'm here as always to talk about some of the most pressing, most intriguing stories going on around the Southeastern Conference. And I'm joined to do that by two of the best reporters covering the SEC today, Matt Zenitz and John Talty. Guys, welcome. How is your first sort of full week of catching your breath in the offseason? We had national title game, we had Senior Bowl, we had all the stuff hitting back to back right after the national title game, and now we just have, it feels like we finally have a week where it's like things are relatively normal this week. Knock on wood.
I don't know. I still think there's stuff going on. There's still coaching staff positions that need to be filled, including at Alabama. I wouldn't say things are just done as of yet.
That's
so
right.
I don't feel that decompression feeling that you were just talking about.
You never decompress, Matt. That's why you are who you are.
Well, Scalisi, I'm sure you're in the same boat as me. For all the people watching, listening, if you have to go through annual reviews, that's what Scalisi and I have been doing the last week, having those conversations, which thankfully are positive. But
that's right.
That's what we kind of slid into this week.
We have only the best.
Yeah, except for mine. I know you don't want to just throw me under the bus. But
we weren't going to tell you this now, Matt. We were going to wait until later. But
yeah.
Well, let's get into. We talked about the Mr. Portal. That's what you've been labeled, Matt, by one of our viewers. That's
Matt,
a pretty good name.
Mr. Portal now.
Yeah, Mr. Portal. That one's gonna stick, I think. Let's get into. We talked about, Matt, that there's still some openings in the recruiting, in the coaching cycle right now, but most of it, I would say, has run its course at this point, and I think it's fair for us to take a moment to look at the winners and the losers of this year's SEC coaching search cycle. Mm-hmm. So let's dig into this a little bit. Let's start with the good news. And Matt, who is your big winner from this year's coaching cycle?
Yeah, I'm going to start with one that people will probably find strange concerning the amount of people that they've lost from their previous staff, but I'm going to start with Alabama. So again, I know people will probably find it strange to hear me say that, considering Alabama at this point, after Carl Scott's decision to leave Alabama for the Vikings, it puts Alabama in a spot where they have now lost 15 members of their 2020 staff, including 5 on-field coaches. But at the same time, that there are not many schools around the country that can fill some of these openings with the caliber of coaches that Alabama has ultimately filled them with. So specifically, that there probably are not too many other schools, if any, that would be capable of getting somebody who as recently as last year was an NFL head coach to come in and be a position coach for a college team, which Alabama obviously accomplished with Doug Marrone. So you look at some of those openings. You get Bill O'Brien, a former college NFL head coach, somebody who has the endorsement of somebody that Nick Saban obviously very much trusts, respects, in Bill Belichick. Get him on board as the offense coordinator and quarterbacks coach. You get Doug Marrone, who we're just talking about, to come in as the offensive line coach. Robert Gillespie, a former team captain at Florida, who won their Orange Bowl team back like 20 years ago, somebody who's established a very good reputation in the coaching world, to go along with his work as a recruiter, to come in as the running back coach. And then Jake Graham, obviously a well-known guy in the SEC, somebody who was a successful player at Tennessee, has experience as a coach in the SEC, including as recently as last year at Tennessee, and get him in as tight ends coach and special team coordinator. And then to go along with that, obviously something that gets talked about a lot on an annual basis is Alabama's support staff. And they have started the process now of filling some of those support staff positions, and have a good amount to fill considering they lost 7 analysts from their 2020 staff, but have started the process of filling some of those openings, including with another former NFL coach in Will Lawing, a longtime Bill O'Brien staffer who during the course of the last couple of years was his tight ends coach with the Houston Texans. So not a bad guy to bring in from an analyst perspective. And then the one other school that I'll spotlight. I know John has some that he'll focus on also, but the one that I'll throw out to go along with Alabama is Georgia. So you have some key members of that staff, and Dan Lanning, Glenn Schumann, guys who were of interest to other schools for some openings, including Dan Lanning at Texas. But Georgia is ultimately able to keep those guys. That they lose Charlton Warren, their DB coach, but replace him with a respected up-and-coming DB coach in Jamil Adai, former standout safety at West Virginia, who was the co-DC and DB coach there for Neil Brown. And then to go along with that, we talked about the analyst stuff with Alabama. For Georgia, you bring in somebody who's pretty well known in the coaching world, who's now going to be helping behind the scenes in an analyst role for them, in Will Muschamp.
Interesting pick there with Georgia just keeping their coaches, which obviously Nick Saban has talked about in the past how frustrating that's been to him and how difficult a part of the process that particularly has been for him. The fact that he has to replace so much of his coaching staff every year. Didn't hear as much from him about that this year, and I wonder if some of that is, we've seen Nick Saban adapt to things that frustrated him in the past, whether it's the hurry up offense, whether it's, spread type concepts. I wonder if part of what has gone on with Nick Saban is he's evolved to understand that losing almost your entire staff and having to replace them is just part of the game. And it's something that he's adapted to and maybe gotten a little bit more efficient at over time. John, to tell us some of your winners in this cycle.
Yeah, I mean, going off of some of what I think Zenit said there, one of the ones that I like is Texas A&M and being able to keep that entire, core staff from a program that did really well last year, was, right kind of on that brink of making the college football playoff, really delivering upon, the expectations that come with the massive salary that Jimbo Fisher has. And I think one of the key ones, of course, is defensive coordinator Mike Elko, who I do think will be a candidate for the Central Florida job. So certainly, in a week from now, this might not be one of my winners if they lose Elko. But I think Elko is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country, has done a terrific job, especially last year, really elevating that defense. And the fact that they were able to keep someone like him and the rest of that staff going into next year, I think is huge. And I think really helps you kind of build some momentum that they've needed and can build off of what they did last year. The other one that I'll just kind of spotlight is Arkansas. And one of the things that I was most impressed that Sam Pittman did, with that first year, was just the staff he built. It was very strong, and I think it led to them having a better than expected year. And as they didn't win a championship like Alabama and Saban did, but Arkansas definitely had to fight off a bunch of people this year for some of their guys. They ended up losing their wide receiver coach at South Carolina, and he was a guy who was highly regarded. Zenit's highlighted him in his top SEC coaches on the rise, but the big one was Barry Odom, and Odom had multiple opportunities to go elsewhere, Texas being the most prominent of those, but people wanted Barry Odom, and that was someone that Arkansas had to fight to keep, and Odom, I think, did not only a terrific job for Arkansas on the defensive side of things last year, but having someone who has success, has been a head coach in the SEC before, I think is really helpful for Sam Pittman as a first-time head coach. And so keeping him, I think, was really important. And I also like some of the other hires they made, Ryan Rhodes being one of them, coming from being a super successful junior college coach at Hutchinson. They obviously, one of the best JUCO programs over the last, decade plus. Having a guy, also a head coach, maybe not the SEC level, but a head coach for many years, having him on staff, I think, is very helpful for Sam Pittman. So I like the fact that they were able to keep some of their key guys and get to kind of build off what they did last year too.
It's so tough. And Arkansas is the only school that you guys have mentioned here that's not kind of in that upper half, that top tier of the SEC that we think of right now. And it feels like it's so hard for a program that's not up there to crack that group, that stratus. And I think you got to start somewhere. I do think Arkansas, I like a lot, and we've talked about them a good bit on this show. I like a lot of the stuff that they've been doing. You look at their recruiting class, and that's really where it starts. I mean, the main thing you have to do to get up to a different level than where you are right now is you got to recruit better players. And I think Arkansas may have done in this class what it needed to do to potentially get to that next level, which is they signed a top 25 recruiting class. They're firmly ahead of the bottom group in their division right now, which actually includes Auburn right now as well. But they recruited better than Mississippi State. They recruited better than Ole Miss. I think they need to. You got to do that consistently. But Arkansas is potentially on their way to getting there. You got to win some games against teams you're not expected to win at some point, and that's really the next big step, I think, for Arkansas. But let's talk about the other side of this right now. Let's go into losers in this SEC coaching cycle. Matt Zenitz, who disappointed in this cycle?
So I don't know if disappointed is the right word, but with LSU, I think overall you look at the job that they did with their staff, and they got people that they were targeting. So you look specifically on the offensive side of the ball. They get Jay Peets, DJ Mangus, two guys that came with strong endorsements from Joe Brady, who obviously had success at LSU, worked with those guys with the Carolina Panthers, and his recommendation carries weight with people inside that building. So that was a win for them there, just based on the fact those were guys that they targeted. They were able to get them on board. You look defensively, bring in Blake Baker, somebody who was the defensive coordinator at Miami, somebody who's well-known in the coaching world. You get Andre Carter to coach the defensive line, somebody who during the course of the last couple of years worked for the Jets, somebody else who successful as a player and up and coming as a coach. But I think probably more so than what anybody else or probably more so than what anybody will remember about this deal with them during the course of the last month or so will be the defensive coordinator search and the fact that there were some guys at the top of the list for them, whether it was Marcus Freeman, Barry Odom, Ryan Nielsen, guys that there was a lot of interest on LSU's part, but they ultimately were not able to get those guys to Baton Rouge and ultimately had to settle for Durante Jones, the Minnesota Vikings DB coach, who I think it's pretty clear that he was not the top option on the list for them.
Yeah, definitely some swings and misses for LSU in this cycle. And it's, I would say they're a pretty good example of what we talked about, that Alabama's had to deal with this multiple times. You win a title and your whole staff disappears. It's tough to replace all those guys with equivalent talent and not miss a beat. So we'll see. I think how we talked about this earlier in the season, that how LSU recovers from that is going to tell us a lot about where that program goes from here. So we'll see. We'll see if they got the job done this offseason. John, what about you? Who's your loser in this coaching cycle?
Yeah, I think it has to be South Carolina. I think that part of the explanation for hiring Shane Beamer was that, all right, we can pay this guy about $3 million, which is a lot of money in real world money, but in the SEC, it's certainly at the lower end, which is going to give him a bigger salary pool to go after a big name offensive coordinator, big name defensive coordinator, basically, kind of making him the figurehead and surrounding him with really strong assistants. And at one point, they had Mike Bobo, they had Will Friend. They were certainly strongly going after Derek Mason, who looked like a possibility. And you thought, all right, Beamer's going to have a really strong staff. And this didn't work out. Brian Harsin is probably not particularly beloved in that South Carolina building right now, plucking away multiple guys from him, including Bobo and Will Friend, who was offensive line coach, hires Derek Mason, who South Carolina was interested in. And South Carolina just kind of swung and missed on a few different guys. Ends up with some guys you hope, I guess, are successful, but certainly not with the kind of brand name and reputation that some of the initial hires South Carolina was targeting were. So I just think that it's something that I think that Beamer needed to do well out the gate. I think that first staff is so critically important, especially again for a guy who's a first-time head coach. And I talked earlier about how I think important that was for Sam Pittman. On the flip side, I think Beamer just didn't do the best job. And again, I think part of it was just that, Brian Harsin came in and took multiple guys that Shane wanted to hire or already had hired.
Yeah. So here would be my question on South Carolina, John, and for either of you, really. We just talked about Arkansas trying to crack that sort of next tier in the SEC West. It feels like at the same time things are sort of more open in the East. There's not really any just real solidified powerhouse that's impossible to unseat in the SEC East. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like anybody ever makes a run at cracking that outside of Florida and Georgia right now. We just haven't seen we haven't seen the sort of mobility of teams in there, even though there are fewer teams that you have to compete with in that division. What do you think it's going to take for anybody to ultimately sort of step up and reach that sort of level that Florida and Georgia seem to be at every year?
I think it's going to come down to recruiting. And the interesting part about South Carolina, when you look at their track record over the course of the last few years, as far as Will Muschamp's recruiting classes, they were pretty good. They were consistently in the top 25. The challenge now will be, you have some talented pieces there, but they need to find a quarterback. So the high profile guy that they had landed during the course of the last couple of years was Ryan Helinski. And Ryan obviously lost out the starting quarterback competition going into last year, and now moves on to a different program. Your starter from last year is now moving on, so you need to find a guy that you can build around. But they do have some pieces stemming from just the success that they had from a recruiting standpoint. But one of the things that stuck out, just to follow up on what John was saying, in terms of these past few weeks for them and this staff, it's challenging when you have four guys locked in to be part of your staff that you're expecting to be part of your staff that ultimately move on to something else. There were four coaches, Tracy Rocker, Mike Bobo, Des Kitchings, Will Friend, who Shane Beamer was expecting to be on his South Carolina staff that ended up moving on for other jobs, which created just kind of a pain in the neck thing for him in terms of then having to replace guys that he thought he had on board.
Definitely has to be frustrating. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say, to your points, one, it's interesting. I will say one hire I did like that Beamer made, hires Taylor Edwards to be the director of player personnel, coming from my alma mater, did a really good job, helped Loxley, help build, a couple top 25 recruiting classes. So I think he did a good job. So that's one that I think could potentially help Beamer, because I think recruiting is going to be critically important. If you look at the SEC East as a whole, I do like what Drinkwitz is doing at Missouri. I think it's going to be, the challenge is going to be, can he get enough elite level talent to, get them at that Florida, Georgia level? But I think that, he certainly seems to have Missouri on the rise. Kentucky, I think, made some good hires. There's some programs that I think are on the rise. Tennessee, not. Vanderbilt going through a new coaching hire. So I think Florida and Georgia are certainly a notch above the rest. But if there's maybe a dark horse that sneaks in the next year or two, I think it could be Missouri.
Yeah, look, it's not like Missouri having success in the East would be totally unprecedented. We have seen that in the not very distant past. They're a program that I think we often talk about as being weird in the SEC, as being an awkward fit. But I think somewhat because of their geographic isolation, they don't have to compete on the recruiting trail at the same level as a lot of the other programs in the SEC East. So they kind of have their own little niche, their own little territory carved out. And I think sometimes that can be an advantage for them. And I do think a lot of the league sort of underestimates them and doesn't take them seriously because they don't have this traditional rivalry with anybody else in the league yet. So we'll be interesting to see there. Speaking of things that are unusual in the Southeastern Conference, let's go into a site that I think is continuing to baffle a lot of people this year, which is Alabama at the top of the SEC basketball standings. They have essentially at this point built a pretty comfortable lead in the league standings. They're 10-1 right now in SEC play. The next team behind them, Missouri, is 6-3. So, look, Alabama has a lot of games to go. There's certainly they're not a lock to win the conference at this point, but it's fair to say they're comfortably in the lead and in position to win the SEC regular season title. Kind of an astounding thing to think about. This is not a program that has had a lot of success, at least not consistently in recent years. But They just seem to have been a cut above the rest of the conference this year, and it's been a weird story. I think we haven't talked about it on the show yet, in part because there have been other stories going on in not just the SEC, but here in Alabama, where we're all based. This is a year that Alabama's football team went undefeated and won a national title. So it has sort of escaped the attention of a big part of the fan base. But now that football is totally in the rearview mirror, I wonder, John, do you get a sense that the fan base is starting to get excited? I mean, look, you and I, part of our job is to try and be aware of what fans are responding to. What are they reading? What are they clicking on? Are you getting a sense of hype yet around this Alabama basketball program?
I think you're starting to see it. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's still some probably hesitations about, is this real? And like you said, I think, unfortunately for basketball lovers in the state of Alabama, basketball attention doesn't really turn to basketball until really around this time of year, because of, like you said, you have national championship runs, then you've got signing day, you had Super Bowl the other day. So I think I'm very curious from here on out, how much attention do we see kind of bump up around basketball? I think the other thing that I'm sure we'll get to in a little bit is that you've seen some Alabama fans start to get excited about the program. This is, pre-Nate Oates. And then there's a fizzle in February, a fizzle in March, and kind of that early love and early attention kind of fizzles out as the team struggles down the stretch. I don't think that's going to be the case for this team. There are some kind of concerns. Certainly, the team hasn't been the same since Jordan Bruner, and Herb Jones is kind of, his health, I think, is certainly a question mark. But I think that fans might be a little cautiously optimistic, in part just because they've been down this road in the past. But I mean, just going on ESPN and seeing Joe Lunardi having Alabama as a potential 1 seed is kind of crazy, at least for me as someone who's been in the state for 7 or so years now, and just have never really seen Alabama basketball at that level.
Yeah, pretty strange. And I think you're right, John. I think there's always going to be some skepticism that that this success in Alabama basketball is real, is long-lived, is going to be a thing that's here to stay. I think we saw it embraced pretty quickly at the other end of the state when Bruce Pearl arrived at Auburn, and the fan base just sort of really bought in pretty quickly. And even before the Final Four appearance for Auburn, I think there was a genuinely new culture that had developed around that basketball program. I don't know that I'm necessarily seeing that yet for Alabama basketball. I think there's always going to be the hardcore Alabama basketball fans. But the real question is, can you get the part of the fan base that only pays attention when football season is over to really buy in and get excited? And even though they might be starting to marginally pay more attention, I don't think you can get buy-in from that part of the fan base until they see an actual run in the NCAA tournament. I think that's what makes believers out of a fan base that doesn't normally believe in the basketball program and doesn't normally pay attention to it. I think they need to get to the second weekend of the NCAA tournament and feel that excitement and feel that sort of enthusiasm that comes with that time of year. To me, that's really what makes sports fans excited about the NCAA tournament, and what makes so many people love it is that it's a season in and of itself. It's not just one game. It is a multi-week thing. And I think if Alabama can get to, the second part of that, the second week of the tournament, I think you could start to see people developing a little bit of a culture around it here in the state.
The biggest thing that,
go ahead, Matt.
Not to cut you off, but
no, please.
Even at this point, just to put into perspective how rare the season has already been as of right now. So first of all, Alabama's in strong position to be SEC regular season champions at the very least. So even aside from the current lead that they have, you look at the remaining portion of their schedule, have 7 regular season games left. 6 of those 7 games come against teams that are in the bottom half of the SEC. So you have to feel good about their positioning going into this final part of the schedule and being in position to be SEC regular season champions at the very least for the first time in almost 20 years. The last time that they were SEC regular season champions was 2002. John brings up a good point in terms of Jordan Bruner. So it makes it more impressive when not only you're having the success, but you're having it without somebody who is going to be a key piece of this team. You're going to get him back at some point. You would have to think when you do, team's going to be even better positioned for moving forward as they get healthier. But to go along with the SEC regular season championship prospects and being able to potentially accomplish that for the first time in almost 20 years, you look at just the talent on this team and you see them in position to potentially accomplish some things that have not been accomplished in a long time by an Alabama basketball team, which is part of the reason that worth paying attention to a large degree if people aren't already. So in terms of SEC tournament champions, I think it's been 30 years since been SEC tournament champions. That's something realistic for them to accomplish. And then obviously the bigger part of this NCAA tournament, I would say this Alabama basketball team probably is as positioned as any in recent history to make a legitimate run. And look, it's been since, what was it, 2004, the last time that they went to Sweet 16, Elite 8. I'd say that this team has a decent chance to become the first one since then to make that kind of run. And who knows, maybe even a better one than that one.
I mean, I definitely, look, as somebody who was in Tuscaloosa during that run, I mean, it was transformational. It was a moment where I think for years after that, Alabama fans paid more attention to basketball, and there was this sort of automatic, we're a basketball school now. We buy into basketball. We're into it. I think that's something that comes with having a lot of success, even just for one season. So it can make a big difference. And it's weird because it's the NCAA tournament, so you're not guaranteed anything. You could be a 1 seed, and if you flop and lose relatively early in the tournament, all that goodwill goes out the window. You don't get anything out of it. John, I know you're pretty tapped into the league in general to SEC officials. What's kind of the feeling right now about how this season has gone? I mean, it's obviously still a pretty weird season. It's been played mostly under the shadow of COVID, but what's we know how they felt about how the football season went. There were issues, but there was ultimately a lot of optimism and a lot of pride about how the SEC handled the football season. What's the feeling so far about kind of how things have gone on the basketball side?
I think all things considered is that it's gone, okay. I think we even talked about it on one of our earlier shows that, people around the SEC knew that basketball was going to be harder than football. There's so much more that comes with it. Even though you have less players, which in theory would make things easier, you're traveling a lot more. There's more games per week. There's just a lot more, I think, logistically that comes with it versus playing 1 game a week. And so I think they knew there were going to be challenges. Obviously, we've seen challenges. I think you're seeing teams now and this is around the country, kind of questioning, should we play a conference tournament? Should we not play a conference tournament? If you have a bad outbreak during your conference tournament and you're going to get knocked, basically missing a ton of players for the NCAA tournament. So there's some issues that are going to be coming up in the next month or so that everybody's going to have to work through. But I don't think again, some teams have dealt with problems like everybody has around the country, but I don't think you've seen any really, terrible issues to this point within the SEC. And so I think that in itself is a win because, everybody knew going in this was going to be really difficult. And I think, as we come up to it in the next couple of months, baseball is going to be very difficult too. I mean, it's just, for a lot of people in the SEC, fan-wise, they kind of tune out after the football season, thought, all right, they did a great job. But you work for the SEC or you work for one of the SEC schools, people might not be paying as close attention, but there are more headaches that they're going to have to work through. It's not just going to end once football season ended. It's basketball, and baseball, and all the other sports that come around things. So there's a lot of things that they're going to have to continue to work through.
Well, we definitely will be keeping you guys posted as the final stretch of SEC basketball season rolls on. Alabama actually plays tonight. They play at South Carolina at 5:30 p.m. tonight. So check out our coverage from that game along with the rest of the season. And guys, hope everybody's doing well around your neck of the woods here. And we will be back again next week for another episode of First Down South. Thanks for joining us.